Marie-Louise Schembri is Design Director at engineers Hilson Moran, where mitigating the impact of climate change is at the top of their agenda. And encouraging the industry to go beyond compliance is a key priority. Hilson Moran is a delivery partner for the Better Buildings Partnership Design for Performance project, or DFP, which aims to address the operational energy and carbon performance gap in the UK building sector. Now, Marie, you have talked about how the private sector has taken over from the public sector in leading on green issues. Can you tell me more about DFP and your role in it?
What we've noticed probably since the end of last year, since the climate emergency protests, is that the private sector in the construction industry, in the design and development of the built environment, has risen up to the challenge, and they truly have. I mean, there's a bit of skepticism perhaps, but they are leading the agenda now. Through initiatives such as the UK GBC and the LETI initiative in London, the commitments that businesses have made through their own operations, the REBA commitment, the REBA challenge, for instance, there's a lot of guidance that didn't exist before on how to realistically achieve carbon and how to actually achieve it. And one of the factors of this change is something called, as you mentioned, the Design for Performance project, which has been in the workings for 5-6 years now by the Better Buildings Partnership. What it is, so historically, we have for the past 15 years, increasingly more recently, simulated buildings for energy efficiency and to predict carbon emissions. We've done that for regulatory reasons to comply with Part L. But there's been this realization over time that that's not a realistic prediction of carbon emissions, and we really need to know what that carbon emissions looks like, solely with the purpose initially of trying to reduce it by design and procurement, but also to understand factors of the operation of buildings that affect that carbon footprint. And what Design for Performance does is it addresses that gap in information that the Part L, the building regulation, doesn't do and hasn't ever done, because it wasn't intended to do that. It's to an extent simplified for benchmarking purposes. And yes, so DFP has been in a pilot stage for some years. It's now entered pioneer project stage. There's a list of about 10 to 12 projects. We have one of them with British Land, that's the One Broadgate. It's one of the more advanced in terms of RIBA stages and complexity. And it does exactly this. It predicts carbon emissions. It also, interestingly, requires a deeper level of collaboration between different parties of a design team, but also for the life cycle of a building. So there's a lot more conversations with tenants that need to take place, with building managers, facilities management teams, on the realities of operation. And we're fortunate to have a precedent in Australia on which the method is based, where this has been running for about 20 years, and it has completely changed the nature of tenant lease agreements, maintenance regimes in buildings, and they have evidence of resulting true and measured operational energy and carbon. And we now have benchmarks to compare with, and the DFP, probably most importantly, includes annual energy targets and disclosure of energy consumption, public disclosure. So it's pretty real, and this is actually, now we're talking about real energy and not false predictions for planning applications. So yes, that's it. And we're very excited to be delivery partners for this project. It's a true change in the industry, and the GLA has recently supported it through their Be Seen guidance. If you haven't seen that, that's the last step of the new last step of their energy hierarchy, which is to disclose energy information and to measure it accurately from the early stages of design.
Very good. So how do you see COVID-19 and how it will affect the design of existing and new office buildings? I mean, do we need to have operable windows in large office buildings to deliver fresh air, for instance?
Yes, it's an interesting question. We're debating that internally. Of course, there's a lot of information out there about the new workspace. Hilson Moran focuses on the environmental engineering side of that. Um, so we look at systems and sustainability in particular. And we do have to be careful that we don't misinterpret information and design buildings to be operating in pandemic status full time, because that has an energy footprint. So what we're recommending is that the buildings are adaptable, that they're able to be resilient when it's time to be resilient, and adapt to a pandemic scenario when it's time to do that. And that's anything from probably most importantly, openable windows. It will have an effect on the types of systems in certain situations. Displacement is probably better at getting the right amount of change, at managing air. We're looking at basically having some form of, it's called a boost mode for scenarios that have pandemic, having more smart sensors in the building so that you can understand whether a meeting room has been used that day or it hasn't, whether it needs to be cleaned or not, being able to flex for out of office operation and that sort of thing, which has contradictions again in energy use, because that's the time we assume that the buildings are shut down or an office is shut down. It's certainly, as you said, pushing in a direction. On one hand, it's pushing in a direction for lower energy solutions, such as mixed mode ventilation and displacement. And on the other hand, it's really, really key to be for adaptability and flexibility to be part of the design strategy, because we don't want to over egg it. We don't want to over design buildings because of relatively short, as long as this feels it's a temporary situation and it might reoccur, but we need to be prepared for it. But it's not a permanent situation, of course. It will also change. We predict it will also increase an already increasing interest in wellness in workspace. There's been an uptake of the WELL standard in the last couple of years, especially where tenants, users of workspace are coming in asking for a WELL certified space or a Fitwel certified space. They are asking for it more now, and we expect to see an increase in that for newly fitted out spaces in the near future. And we're having a lot of interest and calls around that subject as well. And there are collaborations between BREEAM and Fitwel. The LEED certification is upgrading to that in anticipation of a higher market demand. We also probably would see more of what we predicted would happen naturally, but we would see that perhaps people would be more open to the idea of knowing what's in the air and knowing what's around them. So air quality sensors and that interacting with user interfaces on their mobile phones or wearables or their screen. That's the kind of thing we anticipate.
But I suppose also we need to have more adaptable buildings to be able to reuse them, reduce the amount of embodied energy employed, and also to have a more circular approach to how we put buildings together. So what sort of changes do we need to be able to do that?
The whole concept of adaptability in its purest sense and flexibility of use of a space is already important for other factors that don't necessarily relate to COVID, such as some uncertainties in the market around land uses and the role of retail in the future and the future of our high streets, and that subject is very much very, very topical. So we're already doing a lot of work to enable that flexibility of use of space, to adapt from office to retail to data centers, for which there's more demand because of a higher percentage of online use and online work, as you've seen, and an anticipation that will continue to, some level of that will be sustained going forward. So there's that, but then the subject of circular economy increases a level of detail to that subject, because we need to start thinking about demountability of space. So we're talking structural demountability, spatial demountability and adaptability, and also systematic systems need to be adaptable to different occupancies, different uses. If an office is changing to something that has cooking involved in that space, or a larger occupancy profile of such as community space or event space, etc., then systems need to adapt. Certainly, we're talking, well, the GLA is also supporting a circular economy approach, and there's an expectation of that in planning applications in London going forward. And and that has direct effects on the carbon footprint of buildings, because we look at whole life carbon, and that's the mountability and reusability and adaptation, and what that does to the day-to-day and the regular maintenance and upkeep of a space, and then fit outs and refitting when there's a change of tenancy, for example, all have lifetime carbon footprint implications. So when you're looking at the operation of a building and up to the end of life, circular economy helps to reduce that carbon footprint. And that's when we start to really truly start to reach the target levels that the industry is ambitiously targeting through the LETI commitments, for example. So that's all very exciting. And with the subject of the mountability, we're looking at all sorts of things. We're working on quite a number of modular building where the connections are really important, both qualitatively for aesthetic and longevity purposes, but for this whole more circular thinking around building lifetime. No, there's a lot of talk recently about the role of workspace in the recent panel discussion. Very exciting conversation about how we can start to inject workspace in community centres and town centres. That it's no longer, we need to move away from a monocentric city model, which London has started to try to do that. The new London plan and the environmental strategy that the mayor published a few months back actually starts to present London as a more polycentric organism, but I think we need a level of further fragmentation. We just need to acknowledge that in high density living, existing residences don't necessarily have office space or privacy in their homes, so we need to start to create spaces. I'm starting to see that in my own neighbourhood. Pubs trying to increase the daytime use, for example, weekday daytime use, by making pubs into workspaces, providing light lunches and connectivity and separation to ease people back, and to provide people with that option. We're seeing retail units having closed down, unfortunately, as an effect of COVID, but those could be repurposed. There's quite a lot of council-owned community spaces that are vacant and haven't been used because of the cost of management and running and maintenance of those spaces, that could be repurposed into office spaces. We obviously need to rethink on the design of those spaces, but if we could have something that we could quite simply inject into anything from the building in the park, people's back gardens, or just unused space in our community centres, we could reinvigorate local businesses and street life in a different way than we have historically. So there's a lot of excitement and silver lining, I guess, that comes out of this COVID scenario. But yes, that certainly has a lot of social and environmental positives.
Yes, indeed. Well, it'll be very interesting to see what the carbon footprint of a polycentric city is like, actually, when we're doing less commuting, less travel into the centre in the future. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your response to my questions, and very inspiring views of how we actually create a better world after COVID-19. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure.